So there is a lot to cover. This is one of the most dark and horrific times for Israelis, for Palestinians in decades, perhaps maybe, definitely in my lifetime. October 7th, the most bloody, horrific mass killing of Jews since World War II and the Holocaust. The follow-on response has been, instrumentally kind of multitudes in terms of magnitude more than anyone might have expected at this stage. Estimates say 40, 50,000 people have been killed in Gaza. I don't want to kind of rehash or recoup the war, but maybe especially for the audience to get a better understanding of the Palestinian realities on the ground, especially in terms of their governmental structures and maybe what may or may not be possible going forward. I think the media in general, it presents the Israeli perspective frequently, the American perspective frequently, say the Egyptian or Saudi or the Turkish perspective. But the other people in this situation, I feel the Palestinian perspective, we often don't hear. You are not Palestinian yourself. The first time you went to the West Bank, I think it was in the 90s. But just briefly, as I want people to understand, Jahan mentioned it, how it was you have been involved in this process. You have a long period of experience as a negotiator working closely with Israeli and American counterparts. What was it like in the 1990s, a much more hopeful time, the time of the Oslo Accords, and even through, say, 2007, 2008 for the Annapolis negotiations?
Thank you, Ronan, and thank you, Jahan, and thank you all for being here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know how to change the volume. I'm just.
Eric, try. Is this one better? Here, try that.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Y'all don't need to hear me, so.
Okay. We'll just pass it back and forth. So thank you all for coming to tonight's talk. So the short answer is in 2003. I applied for a job based on an ad that I saw it was very cryptically written, looking for technical advisors based in the West Bank, and something about Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And there was no mention of the PLO or, anything political. And I anyway, long story short, as I applied to this ad, thinking, if I get the job, I'll spend 2 years tops there, and I'll come back, I'll get some interesting field experience. I ended up staying almost 6 years, and I did get a lot of great experience, and I was part of a technical unit called the Negotiation Support Unit that was attached to the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization's Negotiation Affairs Department. So the PLO is the official body that represents Palestinians politically. It's the political address of the Palestinian people, which is distinct from the Palestinian Authority. So the PLO is the party that negotiates with Israel. It's the PLO that has embassies, that's represented in the United Nations. Whereas the Palestinian Authority was a structure created by Oslo to administer parts of the occupied territories.
For people to know, you mean the Oslo Accords of the 90s?
The Oslo Accords of the 90s. And so I'm just trying to make sure that that we are all familiar with the terms that we're using. And so, the PLO as the negotiating party has a negotiation affairs department, and there was a group of donors that came together. By donors, I mean governments, mostly I think 6 European governments, decided that the PLO is not particularly good at negotiating, and so they wanted to build up their technical capacity by funding a group of advisors who were lawyers, water experts, economists, people who could negotiate or could advise the negotiators on the kind of technical nuts and bolts of the process. because of the asymmetry between the two sides. Israel, of course, being a powerful state and has a government and an army, and the Palestinians did not have those things. So, so this was a way to help level the playing field. So I worked as a policy advisor on the settlements file. So I collected the maps and data, and we heard about land confiscations in such and such area for the wall or for new settlements or for anything related to the settlement enterprise. We'd go out and we'd collect the information, and I kept the databases, and then we would prepare these files, all the permanent status files that were identified during the Oslo peace process, all of the core issues that were supposed to be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians: Jerusalem, settlements, final borders, the fate of refugees, Palestinian refugees. And then there was a basket of issues that we could just call state-to-state issues. So that there was economics, law enforcement, the kinds of technical things that any two neighboring states would have to work out, right? Border issues. Security was its own file. And that we would build up the information in the event that negotiations would happen, and then they'd be ready to go. So I arrived at a time when there were no negotiations. It was not the height, but it was in the middle of the Second Intifada, right? The Palestinian uprising in the early aughts that was quite violent on both sides and very destructive. And so both sides, there was real mistrust. The Palestinian Authority had, this was a time when the Israeli army had gone back and reoccupied towns that were handed over to Palestinian control, or at least, basic control during the Oslo years. And the Palestinian police even had been sort of driven off the streets. They were being targeted by the Israeli army, and there was real intense mistrust. So this is the environment in which I entered. There were no hopes for negotiations anytime soon, but those negotiations did eventually happen 3 or so years after I arrived. The Annapolis talks that you mentioned, and I got to witness that process and be a part of it firsthand. And so I guess I got lucky in the sense that I was there at a moment that wasn't intensely violent, and that I also got to participate in a diplomatic process that is pretty unique and pretty. It was a huge learning experience for me, watching the internal machinations of Palestinian politics in relation to this diplomatic process, the bilateral process between Israel and the Palestinians, between the Palestinians and the United States and other multilateral actors like the Europeans, and so I had a front row seat, and a lot of that then became material for my book.
I would say it's kind of the seminal book. Even if you aren't here, I'd say it. Is it? Can y'all hear me on that? Yeah. Okay.
It's okay.
I would say if you're interested in the history and legacy of Palestinian-U.S. relations, it's I think it's the best book out there. But maybe just a lot of people, if you're old enough, you might remember the Camp David and the agreements there, the hope and the optimism of the Oslo Accords in the kind of early and mid 90s. They may not be as familiar with this period of negotiations, but what were kind of even if it was just another roadmap, what were the ideas of what was being negotiated, and why did it not come to fruition?
So this was an interesting period because begins this particular period, the post-Oslo period, let's call it, because the Oslo process collapsed in 2000. First with the failure of the Camp David summit, in which Bill Clinton put together this kind of make or break summit. He brought Israeli-Palestinian leaders together, threw them in a room, said, okay, you guys don't come out until you have a deal, and that didn't work, unsurprisingly. But then in the months after that, the second Palestinian uprising broke out in Jerusalem and then spread to the West Bank and Gaza, and that was quite an awful time, because there were, this is unlike the first Palestinian uprising in the late 80s, we saw a completely different dynamic. It was extremely violent. We saw Apache helicopters, firing rockets into urban centers, all the stuff that we now see in Gaza today didn't exist, hadn't happened yet in this time period. So it was new. We saw fighter jets bombing. We saw total sieges of Palestinian towns surrounded by the army, cut off from one another, and there was real humanitarian crisis. People were cut off, couldn't go to work, couldn't go to school. It was a very, very difficult time. Israel was assassinating Palestinian leaders, particularly of militant groups, and on the Palestinian side, there was a wave of suicide bombings, mostly carried out by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but occasionally others. And so it was a very bloody period, and so there was this sense that the Oslo process failed, and there was, of course, everyone had a different view of the reasons for that, right? Israelis blamed Palestinians, Palestinians blamed Israelis, but there was a new diplomatic push that came in the midst of this violence that was aimed at two things. One, at ending the violence with some urgency, and the second goal was to restart a diplomatic process so that the parties could go back. Because there was a sense that even though Camp David, the summit, failed, the negotiations continued after that, and that were they made quite a lot of progress. A lot of people don't know that, but there was the Clinton parameters in December. There was the Taba talks in January 2001. There was a narrowing of the gaps. The gaps at Camp David were huge, and then over the months, they continued to negotiate, even in the midst of this violence, although it became politically difficult for both leaderships. But they continued to negotiate, and there was a belief that many had that a deal could be reached on the watch of Bill Clinton before he left office in January 2001. And they came very, very close. I would say they came closer to clinching a deal that would have established a Palestinian state than any period before or since. So that window between, I would say, September 2000 and January 2001, that was when a deal could have been reached. Of course, it didn't happen. And so there was this sense of, well, we have to get back to this diplomatic process. So part of that was an assessment of, well, what went wrong with Oslo? We need to fix the problems of Oslo. So, well, the Oslo was American dominated. Okay, we're gonna broaden the circle. So there was this thing called the Quartet that was created. The Quartet was the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the UN, four main actors in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. And so this was an attempt at sort of a multilateral effort. And the Quartet came up with a roadmap. The roadmap was a peace plan that was mostly authored by the Americans, by Colin Powell and his team in particular. And it became the framework for reviving. So this was the Oslo process part 2. The problem with the roadmap is that the Israelis hated it because it had mutual obligations, right? Israelis have to free settlements, Palestinians halt violence, and that sort of thing. And the Israelis didn't want to do any of that. Then what changed the dynamic was 9/11. And it changed it obviously for the worse. And so now in the context of the war on terror, the Palestinians had less footing. They were on the defensive. And the Israelis were more emboldened and saying, we don't care about any obligations that we're supposed to have. Forget the roadmap. The only thing that will move any diplomatic process forward is if all the conditions are on Palestinians. They have to reform, they have to halt violence and incitement, and we Israelis don't have to do anything until those things are done. So this is the context in which you're basically there's a stalemate. So this is the environment in which I entered the process. It was not looking very promising in January 2004 when I arrived.
And then to kind of get up to, as Jaha mentioned, the 07-08 Annapolis negotiations, can you just help people get an understanding? You discussed there's PLO, the kind of supranational kind of representation of the Palestinians all around the world, kind of almost in some ways like they're the monarchy and the PA is the actual government. The Palestinian Authority, the PA, is the governing body in the West Bank that has been dominated by Fatah, a political party in the West Bank. And can you explain to people the difference between, even if they're both technically speaking working within the Palestinian Authority or the government, the enormous differences, say, between Fatah and Hamas, and really that kind of shock to the world when Hamas won elections in 2006, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, and results in a Palestinian civil war.
Right. All of this happened while I was there. So yes, the PLO is the official representative of the Palestinian people and the official address for any kind of negotiations or diplomacy. The Palestinian Authority was an administrative body created as a result of the Oslo process, in which Israel, the army was the government before Oslo. The army hired teachers and they had what was called the civil administration. But the army was the ruling body over Palestinians that administered all of their affairs. And Oslo came, and as a result, Israel devolved some of those authorities, particularly the civilian ones, education, trash collection, and limited security responsibilities only over Palestinians in Palestinian urban centers, to this thing called the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed for Palestinians was going to become the embryo of a future state. For Israelis, they had a different view of what the Palestinian Authority was. They saw it more or less as a kind of permanent form of autonomy, right? Because Yitzhak Rabin, when he signed Oslo, did not believe in the end goal being a Palestinian state. That didn't happen until much later, until Ehud Barak in 1999 and 2000. So they had very different conceptions of what the PA should do and what Oslo meant, and that's partly why it explains the failure. So these are two different entities in theory, but the reality is that once the PA was created, because they have the same leadership, right? First, Yasser Arafat was head of the PLO and president of the PA, and then Mahmoud Abbas also wore both hats, and they both wore a third hat, which is they were leaders of their party, Fatah, at the same time. So the lines between these three entities got to be blurred because they're the same people. It just changes the hat depending on the moment. And as far as Hamas emerges in the late 1980s and becomes a very potent political opposition to Fatah. And they're the largest opposition. They're the second largest Palestinian political force in the entire landscape. Okay, and this was a new thing because it's the first time also that a major Palestinian political party or faction was not incorporated into the PLO, and that had a lot to do with the fact that Hamas was so big, and the fear Fatah had was that Hamas was going to replace them. So they couldn't be allowed to enter the PLO except on their terms. So there were negotiations on, how many shares, how many seats would Hamas get in the PLO's parliament called the Palestine National Council and on the executive committee. And they never agreed. So Hamas never ended up joining the PLO, which created a fundamental contradiction in that the PLO was supposed to be the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That meant it was kind of a state in exile. And so it should be representative of all strands of social and political life. So there were labor unions in the PLO, there were women's groups, there were student groups, and then, of course, the political factions were all represented in this parliamentary body called the PNC, except for Hamas. So that was kind of a blow to the legitimacy of the PLO. Then, when the PA was created, Hamas, not having an Islamist ideology, doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist, doesn't recognize Israel at all, whereas, of course, the PLO did. So there was that deepened the split between the two main factions. Hamas boycotted the Palestinian Authority. They refused to run candidates in the first elections that the PA had in 1996. And 10 years later, when they had the second elections, they changed their approach. They saw an opportunity to actually capture the PA. Instead of being on the outside and trying to bring it down, they said, let's just take it over. And that's what they did. They ran elections. They ran for elections in 2006, not expecting to win. And they were, I think, Hamas was as surprised as anyone else that they actually won. So they had then the ability to form a government on their own because they had a majority. So now you have all of these contradictions in these Palestinian political institutions. The PLO is not truly representative. Hamas is, you have now the PA is run by a group that didn't recognize the legitimacy of its creation, right? They totally rejected the PA until they didn't. So those contradictions never got really resolved. And when Hamas won in 2006, because Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization in the United States and in Europe, of course in Israel as well, the international community could not deal with this new government anymore, and so they boycotted it, and that created the conditions for a Palestinian civil war, a power struggle that they tried to resolve initially by doing a unity agreement between Hamas and Fatah, a unity government. The Americans said, hell no, there can never be any Hamas role at all, ever. You have to cancel the elections and then hold new elections. That was a pathway to civil war, for sure. And that's eventually what happened. So I realize I went on too long.
No, but a lot of us aren't familiar with the backstory of it. Just very quickly, you were in the West Bank, you were in Ramallah at the time of this civil war. Obviously, you're working with the much more moderate, kind of reasonable, Fatah. figures and others. How concerned were you or any of your colleagues who might be working with the PA that they too might get killed by someone from Hamas?
Well, I don't think we were worried about getting targeted by Hamas per se, because once the split happened, and as you said, Hamas won a majority of the seats in the West Bank as well as in Gaza, right? Because sometimes I hear journalists and others say, well, Hamas won elections in Gaza. They won elections nationwide, across the West Bank and Gaza, and even East Jerusalem. And they had a solid majority. And it's clear now why, because they were the non-incumbent party that had failed so repeatedly. And as we know, voters always, when times are tough, voters will punish the party in power. And that's precisely what they did. And so it wasn't necessarily out of ideology that people voted for Hamas. It was just the sense of, well, they're the new guys, they're untested, let's see what they can do. But to answer your question, once Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip, and then the unity government was canceled, and there was now two separate authorities, one run by Fatah in the West Bank and one run by Hamas in Gaza. We lived in Ramallah in the West Bank, and Hamas kept a pretty low profile there. They were being targeted by both the Israelis and the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. So they kind of kept their heads down, and their dominant, their domain was in Gaza. So we didn't feel that. But what I worried about, is if Hamas is now in the government, and I'm an advisor to the leadership, am I providing material support to a group that is a designated terrorist organization? So, we all had questions about our liability, like, well, what's going to happen? And those questions didn't last very long because Hamas was, removed from power fairly quickly. But then that split became the defining feature of Palestinian politics from 2006 until this very day.
And again, absolutely not at all to excuse or look past the horrific violence Hamas has committed. But maybe for the audience to get understanding, for a lot of people that think of Hamas, they think of a terrorist organization. But as you discussed, since 2006, they have been the de facto power controlling Gaza. Similarly, at the same period of time, there have been no real elections in Gaza, no real elections held by Fatah in the West Bank. But can you help people understand, you mentioned briefly, it was not necessarily a support of the ideology, but that the role Hamas plays within Gaza, it is the government, there's no choice about it. As horrific as bad as it is, terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland, the IRA committed horrible, horrific crimes, but they had a political wing, Sinn Féin, which is involved in politics at a political level. You think of FARC in Colombia, similarly awful terrorist actions. They were, had candidates later, especially that would be involved at high levels of the Colombian presidency. Can you discuss how, for the Palestinian people, Hamas is a much more complicated and difficult picture than just awful acts of terrorism?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So first of all, I'm just going to say off the bat, and a lot of people will disagree, I don't like the label terrorist organization. I think it's gratuitous, and it's just a way to delegitimize what is essentially a political organization. The reality is, of course, that political organizations often use terrorism, and Hamas definitely falls in that category. They have used terrorism. But to reduce them to they are only a terrorist organization, I think is analytically lazy and not very useful, right? Because, well, they also run charitable foundations, and they have a vast social network that is part of their own patronage network, and how they build a mass of support. They provide social services like the PLO used to do in Lebanon and in the refugee camps, in previous years. So That's how they build constituencies. They have an ideology. They have a vision for how they believe Palestine should be liberated, and then later eventually governed. And so they have much more to offer than just violence, though they clearly embrace political violence. And I think all liberation movements have embraced political violence in one form or another, including the Zionist movement throughout the 1940s, were actually pioneering in their use of terrorism against the British and the Arabs. But again, were they purely terrorist organizations, or were they political groups that had a military wing that also engaged in terrorism? I think that's a more analytically useful way to describe them. So that's a long caveat, I guess. But yes, Hamas. There are people who support it for ideological reasons because they believe that they believe in kind of Islamic jurisprudence and governance, and like other offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a worldview that is rooted in political Islam, right? In the idea that it's not just a Palestinian state, but they want an Islamic Palestinian state, or in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood in other countries, an Islamic state in Egypt or wherever. And there are, obviously there are differences in how, they interpret that state. So there are people who support it because of Hamas's charitable and social services. People who support it because they're not the other guys, right? And I know a lot of Christians, Palestinian Christians, who voted for Hamas in 2006 because they were the new guys. And so let's give them a chance. The old guys not only failed, but they're corrupt. And they're entrenched, and their power is entrenched. And when you become entrenched, you become corrupt. And so there were lots of reasons for people to support Hamas. I think that the international boycott led by the United States of the Hamas-led government in 2006 was a catastrophic mistake. It wasn't going to be otherwise because this was George W. Bush. It was the war on terror. It was Elliot Abrams and Rumsfeld and all of these people who were not interested in accommodating political Islam, right? But my view was and is that they should have encouraged Hamas's evolution in a different direction. So that if Hamas had a stake, if people said, look, Hamas won an election fair and square, everybody agreed it was a free and fair election. The United States congratulated the Palestinian people on a free and fair election. George Bush congratulated the Palestinian people. You held a free and fair election, but now we have to boycott you. That's a mistake. I think that was a fatal flaw in their approach. I think they could have encouraged Hamas to go a different route, but all of that is counterfactual at this point.
You mentioned, obviously, most Palestinians had two horrible choices. Fatah, you mentioned, incredibly corrupt. Its current leader, Abbas, makes Biden and Trump look like youngsters. He's almost 90. But again, it's a bit of counterfactual. Within Hamas, it's an extreme Islamic, intolerant view. Were there gradients of more moderate voices? But even if there were those more moderate voices that obviously were suppressed leading up to October 7th, would any of those voices actually recognized or recognize the legitimacy of Israel to exist the way Fatah had?
It's a good question. So, like any political party or movement, there's a spectrum. And Hamas has a spectrum. It had a spectrum and it continues to have a spectrum, although it is narrowing because of what's happening now. But there are moderates, there are pragmatists, there are extremists, there are hardliners in any movement, and Hamas was no different. And whether I'll give you an example. Every leader of Hamas, so everybody knows about the Hamas covenant, right? Calls for Israel's destruction, blah, blah, blah. That's not particularly relevant. The Hamas's covenant is not relevant. What is relevant is what the leadership says at any given moment. The reality is that every leader of Hamas, going back to its founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was assassinated by Israel, I think in 2003 or 2004, has said, including the current leadership, the ones who are still alive, that they would accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with its capital in East Jerusalem, in more or less in line with the Palestinian consensus. So this is a matter of Palestinian political consensus. We accept a Palestinian state in the 22% of historic Palestine that is the occupied territories today, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. But what makes them different than Fatah is without recognizing Israel. So that was the one thing that they said, we don't recognize Israel. We don't recognize Israel's right to exist because that 78% that became Israel is still, we consider to be the Palestinian homeland, and we don't relinquish our claim. The PLO did, Fatah did, and look where it got them, right? They gave up, they recognized Israel's not existence, they recognized Israel's right to exist. And so that created a dilemma for Palestinians. If Israel has a right to exist in that 78%, then what of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were expelled from those areas? Then they should have never been there in the first place. They didn't have the right to be there. So a lot of Palestinians were very unhappy with this PLO decision to recognize Israel's right to exist. And I'll just also add, this is a purely political formula. It's not legal, it's not moral. States don't have rights. No state has a right to exist. Only humans have rights. People have rights. But this was what was required of the PLO in order to enter the peace process. So they did it. But Hamas said, we're not going to make the same mistake. We're not going to relinquish our claim to the rest of our homeland, although we will acknowledge the political reality that Israel exists. Do they recognize it as a permanent reality? You could question that. Do they recognize it as a legitimate reality? No. But they recognize the reality of Israel without giving it moral legitimacy. That's the part that they sort of withheld. And but they've said, if Israel withdraws from the West Bank and Gaza, we will sign a 100-year truce with, and we'll live in the Palestinian state, and there'll be, they won't officially relinquish all claims, but they're more or less in line with the two-state consensus. So that's the pragmatic side of Fatah, not all of Hamas. Not all Hamas leaders accept that, right? I mean, we were talking in the car about others who completely reject it. And I think there are hardliners today who are becoming more hardline. And the future of Hamas could go either way. It could become uber pragmatic out of necessity, right? Or it could be radicalized by everything that's happening now and saying, why should we ever recognize Israel? We want it all. Look what they're genocidal maniacs, right? And so why should we, we're going to fight to the death. And there are people who say that. But the question isn't what so-and-so says at any given moment, but where is the center of gravity in the movement? What is the temperature reading in that moment? Is the consensus on this side or on that side? What I fear is partly that Hamas will be more radicalized by all of the death and destruction. That's to be expected in the same way that Israelis were radicalized and traumatized by October 7th. And now we've had, I've lost count, 550 days of horror and endless death and destruction. So it's only natural that not only will Hamas be radicalized, but I worry about a much more radical thing, I mean, something else entirely that will emerge out of the ashes of Gaza that will be 100 times more radical than Hamas. Because all they've known is 20,000 orphans. You know, Gaza's the largest cohort of child amputees anywhere in the world. Gaza's been annihilated as a society of 2 million people. Everything has been destroyed. Every single family, 1 out of every 35 Palestinians in Gaza has been killed, right? That means every family, every extended family. So the scale of the trauma is unimaginable, and that does not bode well for the future. And that's why I think, you know, even if you care nothing at all, if you have no empathy at all for Palestinians, you care nothing for the humanity of these people who are being killed in these large numbers, your own self-interest should dictate that this is madness, what Israel's been allowed to do. It will absolutely come back and haunt them. Absolutely. And that's the part that I don't understand, why President Biden in particular didn't put a stop to it. Because by allowing it to continue, he's not only threatening Israel's future, but also undercutting U.S. standing, certainly in the Arab world, but in the global South more generally.
And we'll, you know, I'm sure I'll get to these questions next, but one last question just to kind of fill in the last part of the framework for people's understanding. I know we'll have questions about the U.S.'s relations with the Palestinians, maybe Europeans and others, but in terms of the Middle East itself, you know, what is the role? It's been a historically kind of dubious and oftentimes disjointed role of the major Arab players in the world, whether it be the Egyptians or the Saudis or the Gulf states. You know, for decades, it was very useful for, if it's, I don't care which Egyptian general, if it's Sadat or Mubarak or Sisi, to say, look at the horrific things happening to the Palestinians, you know, call all this out, you know, to kind of deflect any blame or recognition of how bad things are going in Egypt. You know, it's a useful thing to say, obviously, you know, Saudis and the Gulf states, but in reality, they always did very, very little to help Palestinian people. From 1948, you mentioned hundreds of thousands of people are dispersed as refugees. Very few of them are taken in Egypt. A few of them are taken in the Saudis, the Gulf states. The vast majority and their descendants now, a few million, are spread between two of the poorest and most dire kind of economies in the Middle East, in Jordan, and obviously even dire economy with horrific instability in Lebanon. Why is it that those states, in a lot of ways, did nothing? They wouldn't take in any refugees, especially the Saudis. The Gulf states over the years have had tens of millions of foreign workers. Would they not take in Palestinians because they're afraid this Muslim Brotherhood ideology will come with them? There'll be challenges to the monarchy. There'll be challenges to our military government. Why did they do so little? And do you expect them to do anything now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm gonna answer by pushing back a little bit on the premise of your question. I wouldn't say that the Arab states did nothing for the Palestinians. Historically, the Arab states have always been the strategic depth for the Palestinians, right? Palestinians are not a state, they don't have an army, so they are entirely dependent on the Arab states. Certain Arab states more than others. In particular, two, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both of whom have historically done quite a lot. Maybe not enough, but I don't think it's fair to say they did nothing. The Saudis have been advocating for the Palestinians since the 1930s with Theodore Roosevelt, and quite passionately. And then, of course, during the Second Intifada, then Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia had a very, very contentious meeting with George Bush, and you know, he's got tears coming down his face, throwing pictures of dead babies in front of them, saying, you have to make this stop, and was quite adamant. And so Saudi pressure is actually what pushed George W. Bush to accept the idea of a Palestinian state. That was not US policy until George Bush said there should be an independent Palestinian state. That was the Saudis who pushed that. It was the Saudis and the Egyptians in the 1970s who were pushing the Americans, you have to talk to the PLO. There's no alternative to the PLO. You can do whatever you want to ignore them, but you're eventually going to come back to them, and we can help you facilitate. And they were the go-betweens, delivering PLO messages to the Americans and vice versa. The PLO's budget before Oslo was entirely supported by Arab states.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I agree, I shouldn't have said that. Financially, big supporters, politically big supporters. Egypt obviously has tens of millions of poor people itself. It couldn't take in necessarily more. But do you think ever they should have taken in more actual Palestinians into their own country?
I mean, no country took in more Palestinians than Jordan.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not saying Jordan,
but also, I mean, keep in mind that the taking in part is bad for the host countries and for the Palestinians, right? Because they're leaving their homeland. Mm-hmm. So it's not something that anyone wants to see happen. But when it happened, there are very large numbers of Palestinians in Lebanon. Very large number, hundreds of thousands in Lebanon and in Syria and in Jordan in particular. Not as many in Egypt. And why they went to those countries and now the Gulf is because, well, that's where they were immediately displaced, right? When Israel was created and they were, fled or expelled, they went to adjacent countries, which were Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, primarily. But the Palestinians did go to the Gulf. They went to the Gulf and they became teachers, and they became professors, and they became engineers in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Mahmoud Abbas himself has a very long personal history in Qatar. And it was a mutually beneficial relationship. The Gulf states benefited from the more educated Palestinian labor force, and Palestinians benefited because they were earning higher wages in the Gulf, and they were also, all of those funds. So anyway, there's a lot that can be said about what Arabs could have done more. Now, that was then. This is a different moment. There's no question that traditional role that Arab states have played in the past has collapsed. The passivity with which the Arab leaders have looked on, watching these horrors in Gaza is, I think, unforgivable. They could have done far more. Of course, they'll say, well, we pushed Biden. We told him we want a ceasefire. We told him, we tried to pressure him. They could have done more. They still could do more. And I think the key now, if we're going to change this dynamic that exists, if there's any hope at all of thwarting the Trump plan for what is basically the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, it will have to come from the Arab world. It will come from the Saudis, right? Because what does Trump want more than anything is he wants a Nobel Peace Prize for brokering a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. He's not going to get that on this current trajectory of death and destruction and eventual depopulation of Gaza. That will, not even someone like MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who doesn't personally care about Palestinians the way his father and their predecessors had, but he can't, right? Because he's constrained by his own public, and so I believe very strongly that this plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza would be severely destabilizing for Egypt and Jordan in particular, and it could even bring down those regimes. And I think it's one of the reasons why Egyptians are so, such a hard no that we won't take Palestinians, right? Because it's existential for Palestinians and it's existential for these regimes.
And just to follow on to that, to get your impression, about a year ago, I don't know if any of you came, we hosted a pretty well-known national security journalist from Jerusalem Post, an expert on Israeli intelligence and basically especially its history of I suppose, countering Iran. Do you agree with the sentiment that even if the people within their countries might have a strong empathy or sympathy for the Palestinian people, that for MBS, for the Qataris and others, the shared fear and exasperation with the Iranian threat for them and the financial benefits to work with Israel, that to cooperate with Israel is more important to them than perhaps sticking your neck out for Palestinian negotiations.
Yeah, and I do think that's what's different about this moment versus in the past. The Arab public opinion has always been very strongly in support of Palestinian rights, and that's true today. You don't see it because when Egyptians and other Arabs went into the streets in November, I think it was, of 2023, and there were the largest protests that Egypt had seen since the Arab Spring, the regime very quickly shut that down, right? Because they knew that was a threat to them. That it was only a matter of time before people turned their anger from Israel and the United States to their own leaders. So that strength of public opinion, I think, has not diminished and has only increased. What has changed in terms of the public, what has changed is that the regimes barely go through the motions of pretending to care about Palestinians the way they used to. Before, to a great extent, their own domestic legitimacy was defined in relation to the Palestinians. It was part of every Arab leader's internal discourse on some level, right? I'm the champion of the Palestinian cause. It's a bit like Israel and American politics, right? How Republicans and Democrats compete over, I'm more pro-Israel, no, I'm more pro-Israel. And in Arab politics, to the extent that they have politics, right? Because we know they don't have free and fair elections, but they do care about public opinion. So I think that is what is different, is the regimes are much less interested in using the Palestinian issue. They're much more, whether it's Egypt first or Emirates first or Saudi first, that's their philosophy, right? That's kind of a global trend. They're much more interested, the Emiratis in particular, are more interested in Israeli technology. And it's like, they're so far removed from the Palestinian issue, right? They've never had a war with Israel. They've never had prisoners taken or casualties in any, unlike Egyptians or Jordanians or people immediately adjacent. So for the Emiratis, it was easy, right? It's like, well, we don't have an issue. And that's also why I took issue with calling it a peace treaty, right? The Emirati-Israeli normalization deal wasn't a peace treaty because they were never at war. There was never a shot fired, never a single casualty between Israelis and Emiratis. So it was really about mutual interest, and it's about Iran, it's about a common security vision for the region, and it's about the United States. For the Saudis, it's not really about Israel. It's about Washington. But they know that the way to Washington goes through Israel. And that, Israel is sort of the American darling, and if you want Congress to support, whatever weapons deals that the Saudis want, well, then you're going to have to normalize with the Israelis. So that's what's in it for them.
It's just for the sake of time, we could have an next discussion for 2 or 3 hours. I just want to conclude. I'll put a few of these audience questions together. Many of the other ones you've actually already addressed, asking about the role of others in the Gulf, people in the region. But just in terms of, and I know it's not necessarily a topic, especially recently, to have a perhaps optimistic answer for, but at least a realistic answer, to combine a few of these because they flow into each other. Eric asked, I suppose in light of your own negotiations, do you think enough trust can be built again to negotiate successfully? He mentions even when it's between people who have been at war, you think about the Oslo agreements, that many of them are veterans who have been in combat themselves. In part of those negotiations, someone, they didn't put their name, but it just says, what do you think it would take to implement a permanent ceasefire? And then you touched upon some of it as well. But Madeline asked, how do you see multilateral efforts to resolve the conflict? You talked about the U.S. and the regional powers. Perhaps is there any role for the Europeans? And then lastly, another complicated question, difficult question. TD asked, will a Palestinian state ever be created?
Okay, you put a lot on the table.
So
I'm gonna probably ask you to
Sure,
repeat some
I'll go
of them.
back to you. Yeah.
But the first one on, remind me again the first one.
I suppose do you think successful negotiations can happen again?
Yeah.
You've been on the inside of those before. Any hopes there?
Yeah, I'm going to be very pessimistic, but this is my honest to God belief, and it's sad and tragic. I don't see any possibility for any reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians for a very, very long time. The amount of trauma that has been inflicted on each other is so intense, and it's continuing. Right? There's not even a grown-up who can say, okay, all right, we have to do this, has to stop. It's kind of like we can just keep going. And I think, for Israelis, obviously, as you said, it was the deadliest day in Israel's history, October 7th. And that trauma is something that every Israeli carries and that is alive because of the hostages also, right? It's renewed. The fact that the hostages, that there are still hostages being held, is kind of like a daily trigger for that trauma, right? For Palestinians, nothing comes close to you can't even describe in words what they have endured in Gaza. It's not only the deadliest moment in Palestinian history, it is one of the deadliest and most destructive wars of the century. And it has shattered records. I mean, I've seen so many, the harm to civilians has been greater than any war. The starvation has been more rapid than any time in recorded history. I mean, there's so many, like I mentioned, the largest cohort of child amputees. Just the trauma that this generation of Palestinians, multiple generations, will carry into the future will last decades and will not be easily overcome. I hear from my friends who were, one-state solution supporters, right, before October 7th, say...
And just for people to understand, this two-state solution is that an independent Palestinian state next to an Israeli state.
Right.
A one-state solution means they are all within, in essence, the same country, but all have equal status and citizenship,
Right.
just for people to...
Yeah, one state based on equal citizenship rights as opposed to one state based on inequality, or as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and other groups have described it, I think accurately, as apartheid. So yes, the people who believe that, whatever you call it, Israel if you want, but as long as we have equal rights between the river and the sea, those people are saying things like, I don't know if we can live with these people again after what they've done. How can I ever look at my Israeli neighbors who were out demonstrating when there were food trucks trying to make their way in Gaza and they were blocking the way? And polls showed that most Israelis were okay with blocking food. And it's like, how can we live with these people in one state, right? So in that sense, maybe the two-state solution, which has taken a hit over the last 20 years, maybe has gotten, in a perverse way, a kind of inadvertent boost. Because people are like, yeah, we have to separate from you. We can't live together because there's too much pain and trauma between us, and I don't trust you and you don't trust me. So I don't see, I don't see any real possibility of rebuilding that trust, but more importantly, I don't see anyone trying to rebuild that trust, right? I mean, say what you will about George W. Bush, and I've been a huge critic of his, and if you read my book, you know, on the Bush chapter is very critical. But at least he had a sense of urgency. There was a sense of, we can't have this violence continue, and the violence of the Second Intifada was nowhere near as severe as what we're seeing now. But there was just this understanding that if you want a political process, you have to stop the bloodshed as a first step, right? It's not the last step, but it's a necessary first step. First, you stop the bloodshed, then you try to start a political process, and then you gradually build up the trust. There's nobody even doing that now, right? Joe Biden was like, no, here's more weapons, do whatever you want. We'd like you to kill fewer civilians if you could. No, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Okay, that's fine. We don't want you to go into Rafah. Rafah is a red line. We're going into Rafah. Okay, that's fine. We want you to stop starving the population. No, we're going to continue. Okay, that's fine. And there wasn't a moment where they just said, enough. Like, you know, I start to wonder, even if you have no humanity, do you not have a gag reflex? Just to watch this on a daily basis. How? And it can only be that you just don't see those people as equal human beings. They're not the same, they're not the same, they don't deserve to live in the way you and your children and we, right, that we just take for granted. It's the only way, is that they're a different class of human. Otherwise, if they were dogs being slaughtered, on March 18th, when Israel ended the ceasefire unilaterally, they killed 436 people in less than 24 hours. I mean, and where there was no outrage. I didn't get, you know, after October 7th, I was bombarded by media. And I didn't sleep for like a week. Like, I probably got 3 hours of sleep, right? And then when the ceasefire, I got constant media requests. I didn't get a single phone call when 436 Palestinians were killed in a single day, including almost 200 children.
I know maybe there isn't a way to end it, but just to kind of follow up on one or two of those audience questions to tie it in. The ceasefire that was reached, even if it was not maintained, it occurred maybe with the benefit of the Emiratis or other regional players. Do you see any hope or chance that some you know, form of negotiations or talks can lead to another ceasefire, even if we can't get a real agreement for a while?
I mean, I think we know what's needed for a ceasefire. We have it. It's been agreed to. You know, we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We know what's supposed to happen. There's a plan for releasing all the Israeli hostages. It's a phased plan by necessity, right? Because they don't trust each other. Hamas doesn't trust Israel. And for good reason, because Netanyahu says, I just want to get the hostages back, and then we're going back to war. And that's precisely what we've seen, right? And so Hamas has again offered, we will release all the hostages all at once in return for a permanent ceasefire. Israel said no. That was Hamas's opening offer, by the way, on October 8th of 2023. I'm not defending Hamas or their taking of hostages or the people the murder and mayhem that they caused. But if it were about the hostages, that would have happened, right? But it wasn't about the hostages. It was about Netanyahu's political survival. It was about the humiliation of the defense and intelligence establishment who had to exact their revenge. They needed their, not pound of flesh, but millions of pounds of literal flesh. And it was about revenge. And it was about fueling, it was about keeping Netanyahu's coalition together. And we all know, look what happened. The moment the ceasefire deal, Netanyahu agreed to the ceasefire deal in January, he lost a coalition partner, right? Itamar Ben-Gvir quit his coalition. The moment he violated the ceasefire, Itamar Ben-Gvir came back to the coalition. It is about keeping Netanyahu unaccountable for the failures of October 7th, keeping him in power, keeping him out of jail, avoiding, right? Because so that's what this is about, and we know it. Joe Biden said it. Every analyst knows what is fueling this war is the far-right extremists in Israel and Netanyahu's own political survival. And we also know what it will take, right? We know exactly what it will take. There will be a plan for releasing the hostages in return for an end to violence. If Israel wants to get all the hostages, but then continue the mass destruction of Gaza with the goal, as Netanyahu just said a few days ago, that we are moving ahead with the Trump plan for, expelling Palestinians. We're not hiding it. They were hiding it. We're not hiding it anymore. Now they're open about it. So what incentive, if I'm Hamas, if I'm any Palestinian in Gaza, what incentive do I have to release hostages? If I know that not only will the war continue, but the war will continue in order to see my expulsion, right? Because now the Israelis are saying, we're going to expel you. They're dropping leaflets telling them exactly how they're going to expel them. So that's not a diplomatic process, right? A diplomatic process is, no, you have to end the war. But so this is the part that I don't understand, is why give Israel such wide latitude and license to do whatever it wants in Gaza without any concern for the consequences, the blowback toward the United States, the instability in the region. I'm not going to talk about the human side of it, because it's frankly not a priority for Americans, not a priority for most members of Congress, not a priority for American leaders of either party. Right? But if you care about U.S. interests, if you care about your Israeli ally and their future stability, you should be thinking about what sort of conditions you're creating and what that is going to lead to in the future. I didn't answer all the questions, so I apologize.
No. Well, I think you covered almost all the topics we could, and it's been very informative. I think it's helped people learn a lot, especially in terms of Palestinian dynamics that a lot of us don't know about. It's difficult and dire days for your average Palestinian, for your average Israeli. I don't know how or when it'll happen, but God willing, the best for all the Israelis and all the Palestinians is some form of reasonable, ceasefire and eventually some form of agreement between the two groups. Even if we can't be optimistic now, I want to thank you very much for coming here and letting us, informing us so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm happy to stick around and chat with folks.